For years, nobody wanted these 50 acres. Thick buckthorn had swallowed everything, and the land sold at auction for just $300. But when one woman turned her goats loose to clear the brush, they uncovered something no one even knew existed. What emerged from beneath decades of overgrowth would reveal a forgotten piece of history and completely change the value of the land. The parcel appeared on the county auction list with almost no attention. Tucked away at the end of a forgotten gravel road, the 50-acre property had spent years disappearing beneath a thick blanket of invasive buckthorn. The brush had grown so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. From a distance, it looked less like a piece of land and more like an untamed wall of vegetation. Most people who reviewed the auction catalogue skipped right past it. They saw only the problems: overgrowth, uncertainty, and the cost of clearing it all away. When auction day arrived, interest in the property was almost non-existent. Experienced land buyers took one look at the photos and focused their attention elsewhere. There were easier opportunities available, parcels that didn't require years of work before revealing their true potential. Nobody knew what lay beneath the tangled growth, and few were willing to spend money finding out. But one woman couldn't stop thinking about it. The more she looked at the listing, the more curious she became. The property wasn't beautiful. It wasn't ready for farming. It certainly wasn't move-in ready. Yet there was something intriguing about 50 untouched acres, sitting quietly beneath decades of neglect. While others saw a burden, she saw possibility. She knew that land itself was valuable, and sometimes the greatest opportunities were hidden beneath the biggest challenges. Friends questioned her interest immediately. "Why would you want that place?" one asked. Another laughed and called it a money pit before she had even placed a bid. The warnings continued. Clearing buckthorn was expensive. Heavy equipment would cost a fortune. There was no guarantee that anything worthwhile would be uncovered beneath the brush. For all anyone knew, the property could remain a tangled mess, no matter how much effort was poured into it. Still, the doubt of others only made her more determined. As the auction entered its final moments, she watched the bidding carefully. To her surprise, almost nobody seemed interested. The price remained shockingly low. One by one, potential buyers moved on. Then, with a final bid of just $300, the property became hers. For a moment, she could hardly believe it. She had just purchased 50 acres of heavily overgrown land for less than the price of a household appliance. Standing there with the paperwork in hand, she felt a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. She had no idea that hidden beneath the sea of buckthorn was a discovery that had been waiting decades to be seen again. A few days after the auction, she visited the property for the first time as its new owner. The reality was even more overwhelming than the photographs had suggested. The buckthorn had taken over nearly every corner of the land. Thick clusters of thorny branches stretched in every direction, creating a maze that was nearly impossible to navigate. In some areas, the growth was so dense that she could barely see a few feet ahead. What should have been open acreage felt more like a forgotten wilderness. As she walked along the edge of the property, she searched for signs of what might lie beneath the overgrowth. Old fence posts occasionally poked through the brush. Here and there, large stones appeared among the weeds before disappearing back into the tangled vegetation. It was impossible to tell what belonged there and what had simply been swallowed by nature over time. The deeper she looked, the clearer the challenge became. Hiring heavy machinery to clear 50 acres would cost thousands of dollars, far more than she had paid for the land itself. Professional crews could spend weeks cutting, hauling, and grinding through the buckthorn. Even then, there was no guarantee the invasive plants wouldn't return. Neighbors were skeptical about her chances. Many had watched the property sit abandoned for years. Some couldn't remember the last time anyone had successfully walked through its interior. To them, the land seemed beyond saving. They admired her optimism, but doubted that anything meaningful could be done without a massive investment of money and equipment. Yet despite the obstacles, she wasn't discouraged. Standing at the edge of the overgrown acreage, she felt the same curiosity that had driven her to place that winning bid. Somewhere beneath the wall of buckthorn was the real property, the land she had actually purchased. The challenge now was figuring out how to uncover it without spending a fortune. And soon, An unusual idea would give her exactly the solution she needed. For weeks, she searched for a practical way to reclaim the land. Every option seemed to lead back to the same problem: cost. Renting heavy equipment was expensive, and hiring professional clearing crews would quickly add up to many times the amount she had paid for the property. Spending thousands of dollars on land purchased for only $300 simply didn't make sense. Then she remembered something she had seen on a small farm years earlier: goats. Unlike cattle or horses, goats had a reputation for eating almost anything. Farmers often used them to control invasive plants, clear unwanted brush, and reclaim neglected fields. Buckthorn, one of the biggest problems on her property, was actually something goats enjoyed feeding on. The more she researched the idea, the more it seemed like a perfect solution. Instead of fighting the overgrowth with machines, she could let nature do the work. A few weeks later, a small herd of goats arrived on the property. The animals wasted no time exploring their new surroundings. While the dense thickets looked intimidating to people, the goats seemed completely unfazed. They pushed into the brush, nibbling leaves, stripping branches, and chewing their way through areas that had been untouched for years. People in the community were curious. Some stopped by to see whether the unusual plan would actually work. Others laughed at the idea of a handful of goats taking on 50 acres of buckthorn. To them, the task seemed impossible. The property had spent decades disappearing beneath invasive growth. How could a herd of animals make any real difference? But she remained patient. Day after day, the goats continued their work. Slowly, almost unnoticed at first, small openings began to appear in the wall of vegetation. Patches of sunlight reached the ground. Hidden sections of the property started emerging from beneath the brush. And before long, something strange began catching her attention deep inside the clearing land. As the weeks passed, the goats settled into a steady routine. Every morning, they spread across different sections of the property, pulling leaves from branches and stripping away the thick buckthorn that had dominated the landscape for years. What seemed impossible at first was slowly becoming reality. Areas that had once been hidden behind walls of vegetation were beginning to open up. The transformation was remarkable. Places she had struggled to walk through during her first visit were now accessible. Sunlight poured onto patches of ground that had likely been shaded for decades. Native grasses and small plants, long suppressed by the invasive buckthorn, started reappearing. With every passing week, the land revealed a little more of itself. She spent as much time as possible exploring the newly cleared sections. Each visit felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. Features that had been completely invisible before were now coming into view. Old trees stood where dense brush had once concealed them. Weathered fence posts emerged from the ground like markers from another era. Occasionally, she found unusual piles of stone scattered beneath the vegetation. At first, she assumed the rocks were random. After all, old properties often contained leftover building materials, collapsed walls, or natural stone deposits. But the more the goats cleared, the more curious the formations became. Some of the stones appeared arranged rather than scattered. A few seemed to form straight lines, something nature rarely creates on its own. The discovery lingered in the back of her mind. Each time she returned, the shapes became easier to see. What had once looked like isolated rocks now appeared connected. There was a pattern emerging beneath the brush, though she couldn't yet tell what it meant. The goats continued their work, uncovering more ground every day. Then one afternoon, while walking through a freshly cleared area, she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. Partially hidden beneath the remaining vegetation was what looked unmistakably like the corner of a stone structure. Suddenly, the mystery of the property became far more intriguing than anyone had imagined. The discovery stayed on her mind for days. What she had seen didn't look like a natural rock formation. The stones seemed too organized, too deliberate. Yet with so much brush still covering the area, it was impossible to tell exactly what she was looking at. She knew only one thing for certain: something man-made was hidden beneath the remaining buckthorn. The goats continued their work. Each day, more vegetation disappeared. exposing additional sections of the mysterious formation. What had first appeared to be a single corner gradually expanded into what looked like part of a wall. Large stones sat tightly together, fitted in a way that suggested craftsmanship rather than chance. The structure seemed old, very old. Curiosity quickly turned into excitement. Whenever she visited the property, she headed straight for the area. She watched as the goats stripped leaves from branches surrounding the stones. Little by little, the shape became clearer. The wall extended farther than she had originally thought. It wasn't an isolated feature buried in the landscape. It appeared to be part of something much larger. Soon, another unusual detail emerged. Partially concealed beneath vines and brush was a dark opening between the stones. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a shadow, but after clearing away a few branches, she realized it resembled an entrance. The opening was narrow and partially collapsed, yet it was unmistakably connected to the structure. Questions began piling up. Who had built it? How long had it been hidden? Why did nobody in the area seem to know it existed? She spoke with a few long-time residents nearby. Most were just as surprised as she was. Some had lived in the area for decades and had never heard of any structure on the property. Others vaguely remembered stories about old buildings that once stood on abandoned land, but nobody could provide definite answers. The mystery only deepened. As more of the site emerged, the stonework revealed remarkable detail. The walls were thick and solid, built to last. Even after decades of neglect and overgrowth, much of the structure remained intact. Whatever it had once been, it was clearly important enough for someone to invest significant effort into building it. Standing before the newly uncovered stones, she realized this was no longer just a story about reclaiming overgrown land. Hidden beneath years of buckthorn was a forgotten piece of the past, and she was about to discover exactly what it was. By the time summer was nearing its end, the transformation of the property was impossible to ignore. The goats had cleared large sections of buckthorn, exposing ground that had not seen daylight in decades. What once looked like an endless wall of brush now revealed open spaces, mature trees, and features nobody knew were hiding beneath the overgrowth. Most remarkable of all was the stone structure. With much of the surrounding vegetation gone, its true size was finally becoming visible. What had started as a few scattered stones had grown into something far more impressive. Thick stone walls emerged from the earth, outlining a building that had somehow remained hidden for years. The entrance she had noticed earlier became clearer as well, revealing a passage that appeared to lead into the structure itself. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Every visit uncovered another detail. More walls appeared. Additional stonework came into view. The structure seemed carefully constructed, built with a purpose that was still unknown. Despite decades of neglect, much of it remained surprisingly intact. Word of the discovery began spreading. Neighbors who had doubted the property now stopped by to see it for themselves. Many were stunned. Some had lived nearby for most of their lives and had never heard of any building hidden on the land. Others were amazed that something so large could remain concealed for so long. Speculation quickly followed. People offered theories about what the structure might have been. Some thought it was the remains of an old farmhouse foundation. Others guessed it could have been a storage building or part of a long-forgotten settlement. Everyone seemed to have a different explanation, but nobody knew the truth. Determined to find answers, she began researching the property's history. Old records, maps, and local archives held clues waiting to be uncovered. And as she dug deeper into the past, a surprising discovery would finally reveal the true purpose of the mysterious structure hidden beneath the buckthorn. The search for answers led her far beyond the boundaries of the property itself. What had started as a simple attempt to identify a mysterious stone structure soon turned into a journey through local history. She visited libraries, examined old maps, and searched through county records, hoping to find any reference to the land before it disappeared beneath decades of buckthorn. At first, the clues were scarce. Modern property documents mentioned little about the structure. The land had changed hands several times over the years, and many details had been lost along the way. But as she dug deeper into older records, a pattern began to emerge. References to a stone building appeared in documents dating back more than a century. Then she found the breakthrough. An aging map showed a small structure marked near the exact location where the goats had cleared the brush. Beside it was a note identifying the building as an ice house. The discovery immediately explained many of the features she had observed. Before electric refrigeration existed, ice houses played a crucial role in everyday life. During winter, large blocks of ice were cut from frozen lakes and rivers, then transported into specially designed buildings. Thick stone walls and underground construction helped keep temperatures low, allowing the ice to survive through much of the year. Families, farms, and local businesses depended on these structures to preserve food long before modern refrigerators became common. Suddenly, the mystery made perfect sense. The heavy stone walls were not decorative. They were designed to provide insulation. The partially buried construction helped maintain cool temperatures. Even the narrow entrance matched the design of many historic ice houses built during the 19th century. Excited by the discovery, she shared her findings with local historians. Several were fascinated. Few surviving ice houses remained in the region, and many had collapsed or been demolished decades ago. The fact that this one had remained hidden beneath vegetation may have actually helped protect it from destruction. What everyone had assumed was a random pile of stones turned out to be a rare piece of local history. And the more she learned about the forgotten ice house, the more remarkable its story became. Hidden beneath buckthorn for decades, it had quietly waited for someone to uncover it again. And now, its connection to the people who once lived and worked on the land was finally coming back to light. Now that the structure had been identified as an ice house, she wanted to know who had built it and why it had been forgotten. Her research led her further into the property's past. Old county records revealed that the land had once belonged to a farming family that settled in the area during the late 19th century. At the time, the surrounding countryside looked very different. Small farms dotted the landscape, and families relied heavily on self-sufficiency to survive. Back then, an ice house was more than a convenience. It was an essential part of daily life. During harsh winters, workers would harvest massive blocks of ice from nearby ponds and streams. The ice would be packed inside the stone structure, often insulated with layers of sawdust or straw. Throughout the warmer months, the stored ice helped preserve meat, dairy products, and other foods that would otherwise spoil. As she continued digging through historical records, she discovered that the ice house had once been considered one of the property's most valuable features. It allowed the farm to store food longer than many neighboring properties, giving the owners a significant advantage during hot summers. But time eventually changed everything. The arrival of modern refrigeration made structures like the ice house obsolete. Families no longer needed to harvest and store ice each winter. As newer technology spread across rural communities, many ice houses were abandoned. Some collapsed from neglect. Others were dismantled for their stone. Many simply disappeared from memory. This one had suffered a different fate. Instead of being demolished, it had slowly been swallowed by nature. Buckthorn and other invasive plants spread across the property year after year. Branches covered the walls. Roots crept through cracks in the stonework. Eventually, the entire structure vanished beneath a blanket of vegetation so thick that few people even knew it was there. The more she learned, the more extraordinary the discovery felt. For decades, people had passed by the property without realizing a rare piece of local history was hidden only a short distance away. What appeared to be an abandoned, worthless tract of land had preserved a forgotten chapter of the community's past. And thanks to a herd of goats, and a willingness to take a chance on neglected land. That chapter was finally being uncovered once again. By the following year, the property barely resembled the land she had purchased at auction. The thick walls of buckthorn that once dominated the landscape had been pushed back dramatically. Open spaces stretched across areas that had previously been impossible to enter. Native grasses returned. Sunlight reached the forest floor. Mature trees that had been hidden for decades once again stood proudly across the acreage. The goats had done far more than clear brush. They had revealed the true character of the land. What neighbors once dismissed as a hopeless tangle of invasive vegetation was now becoming one of the area's most interesting properties. Visitors who remembered the original condition of the acreage were stunned by the transformation. Many could hardly believe it was the same place. But the greatest change wasn't the appearance of the land. It was the discovery of the historic ice house. As news of the structure spread, local residents, history enthusiasts, and preservation advocates began showing interest. Some visited simply to see the remarkable stone building for themselves. Others were fascinated by the story behind it. A structure that had disappeared from public memory for decades had suddenly become a topic of conversation throughout the community. The discovery also changed how people viewed the property. When she first bought the land, most saw only weeds, thorns, and endless work. Now they saw history, character, and potential. The forgotten ice house gave the acreage a unique identity that couldn't be found on ordinary parcels of land. For her, the experience was deeply rewarding. She had never expected a simple land purchase to uncover such an important piece of the past. What began as an effort to reclaim neglected acreage had evolved into something much larger. A chance to preserve a historical landmark that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. Standing near the stone walls one evening, she looked across the transformed landscape and reflected on how far things had come. The property that nobody wanted had become a place people were eager to visit. And the most surprising part was that none of it would have happened without a small herd of determined goats patiently clearing away the brush, one bite at a time. Looking back, it was hard to believe how the entire journey had begun. A forgotten listing in a county auction. 50 acres buried beneath invasive buckthorn. A property that most people ignored without a second glance. For just $300, she had taken a chance on land that seemed destined to remain hidden beneath a sea of thorns and brush. At the time, nobody could have predicted what would happen next. What started as a simple effort to reclaim overgrown acreage became an unexpected adventure into the past. The goats she brought in to clear the vegetation did exactly what she had hoped they would do. But they also did something nobody anticipated. With every patch of buckthorn they consumed, they peeled back another layer of history. Slowly, the forgotten stone structure emerged. First a few rocks, then walls, then an entrance. Finally, an entire ice house that had remained concealed for decades. What many assumed was worthless land turned out to be home to a rare historical treasure that had quietly survived while the world around it changed. The discovery transformed more than the property itself. It changed the way people viewed the land. Neighbors who once doubted her decision now admired her determination. Local historians celebrated the rediscovery of a structure many believed had been lost forever. Visitors came to see the ice house and hear the remarkable story behind it. For her, the greatest reward wasn't financial. It was knowing that something important had been saved from being forgotten. Had the property remained untouched for another decade, or even another generation, the ice house might have disappeared completely beneath the relentless spread of vegetation. Instead, it had been given a second chance. Standing beside the old stone walls, she often thought about how close the structure had come to remaining hidden forever. Beneath those acres of buckthorn was a story waiting to be told, and all it took was one person willing to see potential where others saw only problems. In the end, the lesson was simple. Opportunities are not always obvious. Sometimes they are buried beneath years of neglect, hidden behind obstacles that discourage everyone else from looking closer. Sometimes they appear in the form of a property nobody wants, a challenge nobody wants to tackle, or a path that seems too uncertain to follow. And sometimes, the greatest discoveries come from taking a chance, because on 50 forgotten acres bought for just $300, a herd of goats uncovered far more than an old ice house. They uncovered a piece of history that the world had almost forgotten. Stories like this remind us that some of the most incredible discoveries aren't found by experts or treasure hunters. They're found by ordinary people willing to take a chance where everyone else sees a dead end. What began as 50 forgotten acres covered in buckthorn became a journey into history, proving that the past is often hiding in the places we least expect. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next incredible discovery. And let me know in the comments, if you had purchased this property for just $300, would you have taken the risk, or would you have walked away? Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone curious enough to uncover them.